I could just inhale this. My friend Kate has a community garden, and in her garden plot, she has a rhubarb plant that is huge and extremely prolific. And she has so much of it, she can't use it all. So she gave me a kilo of rhubarb. So I'm gonna make a rhubarb crumble. Unfortunately, when she gave it to me, my air conditioner was broken, so I could not bake anything because my kitchen was 30 degrees. Now it's fixed, so I can turn my oven on again. But in the meantime, the rhubarb went a little limp. That's okay, because we're gonna roast it and it's gonna be fine. Fresh rhubarb from the garden means we gotta wash it. I just like to fill the sink with a bit of water so I can do this. So obviously rhubarb grows with leaves. Kate removed the leaves for me very kindly because the leaves are poisonous. You cannot eat them. They're very high in oxalic acid. So trim the leaves and only use the stalks. Usually rhubarb can be quite dirty at the base of the stem, so I try to clean that part really well. Kate's given me a little over a kilo of rhubarb, which is awesome. When I wrote out this recipe originally, I tested it with a kilo of rhubarb. A little bit more is not going to hurt. If you want to double the amount of rhubarb, you need to use a bigger baking dish, for example, and double the thickener and the sugar, of course. But I think I have like 100 grams more. It's really not significant. Short people problems. I like to bake with plain rhubarb because we're often mixing strawberry with rhubarb, and then I find it tastes less like rhubarb. I want that bright acidity of the rhubarb with nothing else in the way. So we're going to mix half the rhubarb with the cornstarch and the sugar. Roast it, get those juices flowing, then that'll give us a chance to stir everything properly together in the filling with the rest of the rhubarb before we add the crumble topping. I'm going to combine the sugar with the cornstarch first, get them evenly mixed before I add in the rhubarb. What's nice about mixing the sugar with the cornstarch first is that it helps you get those lumps out so that your filling will be more smooth without any cornstarch lumps. I'm going to sprinkle in all this sugar and cornstarch mixture. Roasting half the rhubarb first before adding the rest of the rhubarb and the crumble topping also allows you to double up on the rhubarb, because as you can see, with half the rhubarb, this baking dish is pretty much full. So it's going to roast down, and then we can add even more rhubarb. Just add a little water to help this stick. You can do this with a spoon or 2 spoons. I just use my fingers. It's a bit messy. You don't have to worry at this stage if all the rhubarb gets coated in the sugar and the cornstarch, because we're going to pause midway in the baking to give it a good stir with the rest of the rhubarb. And at that point, that's when you'll really get an even mixture. Some people will butter their pan. I don't, but that won't hurt. I always forget to, if we're being honest. That looks pretty good, but I'm not too worried because, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to roast it and then we'll have an opportunity to stir it before we top it with the crumble topping. I am going to add some vanilla bean paste later, but I'm going to do it partway through the baking because it'll be easier to stir it in because it's quite goopy at this point. Top this with a layer of parchment and then a layer of foil. I'm not putting the foil in direct contact with the rhubarb because of the acidity of this vegetable. Aluminum will react under acidic conditions. And whenever you're baking a fruit dessert, like a pie or a crumble or a crisp, I always put it on a parchment lined sheet pan because These things have a tendency to bubble over, and then the juices will burn on the bottom of your oven. Plus, nobody likes to clean their oven, so this just makes your life so much better. Now, while the filling is baking, you have time to make the crumble topping. Texture will be different depending on the texture of the butter. If you start with cold butter, you'll have a more sandy texture. If you make a cookie dough, it's going to be perhaps more soft and chewy texture. It's really up to you. I'm just separating out the cubes of butter before I add them to the dry ingredients. You could also do this step with a pastry cutter if you want. I'm just used to using my hands, so that's what I do. I like to toss the butter in the dry ingredients, get it all coated, and then I tend to smush the pieces between my fingertips and my thumbs. Flatten them out. And do some sanding, rubbing the mixture between the palms of your hands. This will help you work the cold butter into the flour, coating that flour with butter and the butter with flour. So you'll get a nice sandy texture. I like to work in the butter really well and get a more even texture, just because I don't like a crumble topping that's very floury or powdery. I prefer a more chunky topping. Some people will add ground almond to the topping. You could also add oats, which is typically for a crisp. You can do a lot of things. Chopped nuts, like pecans, walnuts are really great. It's up to you, but I'm going real plain and simple. You can see now there's not as much flour per se. It's not as powdery. The mixture is more looking like wet sand. It's not even, but that's okay. And when it comes time to topping the fruit, you can squeeze it together to make clumps. I think I'm going to stop here. You can keep this in the fridge until your filling has baked. So the rhubarb is partway through the roasting time. So I pulled it out just to check on it, give it a stir, then I can add the rest of the filling ingredients and top it with a crumble. This looks really nice. So we can see the sugar hasn't fully dissolved yet, but it's getting there. And now we have the chance to give it a good stir to help it dissolve. This way we can also get into those corners. The rhubarb will soften as it bakes and it will break down a bit. That's the beauty of baking the filling in 2 steps. It'll allow you to have different textures of rhubarb in your filling. Okay, there's the rest of the rhubarb. Since some of the rhubarb started to break down, that gave us more room for more rhubarb, which is always a good thing in my books. Just going to flatten it out a bit, make sure the fruit layer is pretty even. There's the crumble topping. So as I mentioned, I'm just giving it a squeeze. It's going to be messy. The goal is to top all the fruit with some crumble. So now we're going to bake it again. This time we're going to bake without foil because the goal is to brown the top, among other things. I just realized I forgot the vanilla. Oh yeah. So nice and bubbly. Good thing I have parchment paper and a sheet pan under there. Oh my. So there's a lot of juices all around the pan of crumble, which are going to be really sticky. I'm just going to transfer the baking dish to a sheet pan that is lined with a wet paper towel to try and reduce the stickiness on the bottom for when I'm serving it. I don't mind the drips on the sides, it's just the bottom that gets really sticky. You can also lift, sort of rub. Just don't let it drip on the back. Yeah, there you go. Let's let it be. It's gotta cool for like a few hours, if not overnight. You have to be patient. Time for the taste test. Oh yeah. The rhubarb crumble is so good with the vanilla custard sauce. 10 on 10. Would recommend doing that. It's a good combination. I've eaten too much rhubarb crumble.